Emily had always felt invisible in her own family. From the time she was a little girl, she could see the way her parents looked at her compared to her brothers and sisters. Her brothers were praised when they lifted heavy buckets of water or carried wood. Her sisters were admired for their beauty or their laughter. But Emily, thin and quiet, never seemed to fit into the picture of what her parents wanted. When she was too weak to keep up with the others in the field, her father would shake his head and mutter under his breath that she was useless. She heard the word more times than she could count, and after a while she began to believe it herself. The small village they lived in was tucked between wide fields and thick forests. Life there was hard. Families had to grow their own food, raise their own animals, and cut their own wood. No one had extra money, and every pair of hands mattered. Emily wanted to help, she truly did, but no matter how hard she tried, she seemed to fall short. The heavy baskets made her stumble. The hot sun made her faint, and even her attempts at cooking ended with scolding. Her family grew frustrated with her and treated her more like a burden than a daughter. As she grew older, the whispers in the village became harsher. When girls her age were being courted, no one came to Emily's door. Her family noticed, and the disappointment in their eyes became sharper each year. By the time she turned 19, her parents stopped hoping for a marriage proposal from a local man. They began to speak openly about what to do with her, as if she were an object and not a person. Emily would overhear their conversations late at night, her mother's voice tight with worry, her father's voice heavy with anger. "We can't keep feeding her if she can't do her share," he said once. "She will never find a husband here." Those words struck her heart deeper than any knife could. The turning point came when the family's debts grew worse. Harvests had failed, and their small savings disappeared quickly. One evening, a man from the mountains came down to the village. His name was Daniel. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the calm strength of someone used to surviving alone. People knew him as the mountain man who lived in the high woods far from neighbors. He came only a few times a year to trade fur or buy supplies. Children whispered stories about him, saying he was strange, maybe even dangerous. But he was a man who could provide, and that made him valuable. Emily's parents saw him as an answer to their problem. He was unmarried, lived alone, and had no one to cook or tend to his home. Maybe he would take Emily. Maybe he would even pay for her, easing their debts. That night, without asking Emily what she wanted, her father made the offer. Daniel stood silently, listening, his gray eyes steady. The bargain was struck with a handshake and a promise. When Emily heard the news, she felt the ground slip away beneath her. She was not asked if she wanted to go. She was not given time to think. Her mother simply folded her few clothes into a bag, pressed it into her hands, and told her she should be grateful that someone was willing to take her. "This is the best for you," her mother said, though her eyes did not meet Emily's. Her siblings avoided her gaze altogether. In that moment, Emily realized she was truly alone. The next morning, she left the only home she had ever known. She sat silently on Daniel's old wagon as it rolled away from the village, the sound of the wheels crunching over dirt roads echoing in her ears. She kept her head down, tears sliding down her face. The air grew colder as they traveled farther into the mountains, the trees taller and closer together. Daniel didn't speak much, only glancing at her once or twice as if sensing her fear. His face was rugged, lined from years of hard weather, and his hands were rough with work. Yet there was no cruelty in his expression. As hours passed, Emily's thoughts tumbled one over the other. She felt shame for being treated as something to be traded away. She felt fear for what awaited her in the deep woods with a stranger. And beneath it all, a tiny spark of hope flickered. Maybe, just maybe, away from the whispers of the village, she could start again. The mountain path grew steeper, and the wagon bumped over rocks. Emily clutched her small bag tightly, her heart racing with every turn. The forest seemed endless, with birds crying overhead and the smell of pine heavy in the air. She had never been this far from her village before. She wondered if she would ever see it again, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to. By the time they reached Daniel's land, the sun was sinking low. His cabin stood in a small clearing, sturdy and simple, built from thick logs. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a small garden lay on one side, covered with frost. It wasn't grand, but it was strong, and Emily could see that every piece of it had been built by his hands. He helped her down from the wagon without a word, his touch careful but firm. She stepped onto the ground, her legs weak, her heart heavy. The night air was sharp and cold, and the sound of the forest surrounded her, owls calling, branches swaying, a stream rushing nearby. For a moment, she closed her eyes, feeling both fear and a strange sense of quiet she had never known in the crowded village. She was far from everything she had known, far from the voices that called her useless. What lay ahead she didn't know, but she could sense that her life had changed forever. That first night in the mountains, Emily lay awake in the small corner Daniel had cleared for her. The firelight flickered across the wooden walls, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits. She thought of her family, of the way they had sent her away so quickly, as if losing her meant nothing. Her chest ached, but tears would not come. Instead, she stared into the fire until sleep finally pulled her under. Daniel, on the other hand, sat by the fire long after she had fallen asleep. He was not a man of many words, but he had seen the look in her eyes, the fear, the sadness, the weight of being unwanted. He did not know what the future would hold between them, but one thing was clear to him. This young woman had been thrown away by those who should have loved her, and in his quiet way, he made a promise to himself that she would never be treated like that again. The days that followed were unlike anything Emily had ever known. Life in the mountains was quiet, filled with the sounds of nature rather than the voices of neighbors or the harsh scolding of her parents. At first she felt lost in the silence. She would wake early and sit by the small window, staring at the endless trees and wondering if she truly belonged here. The air was cold, sharper than the air in her village, and every breath seemed to remind her she was far from the only world she had known. Daniel, the mountain man, kept busy from dawn to dusk. He chopped wood with steady strength, repaired the roof before winter snow came, and checked his traps deep in the forest. He moved with the skill of someone who had lived this way for many years, each task done without complaint. Emily watched him at first from a distance, unsure of what she was supposed to do. No one had told her what role she was meant to play here, but slowly she noticed something that surprised her. Unlike her family, Daniel never called her weak or useless. He never raised his voice, never looked at her with disappointment. He didn't force her to work beyond what she could handle. Instead, he showed her small things: how to keep the fire going, how to sweep the cabin floor, how to fetch water from the stream without spilling it. He taught her patiently, without judgment. For the first time in her life, Emily felt that her efforts mattered. On the third day, Daniel came back from the woods with a bundle of timber. He set it down outside the cabin and began cutting it into neat pieces. Emily stood in the doorway, her hands twisting nervously. "What are you building?" she asked softly, almost afraid to speak. Daniel paused, wiped the sweat from his brow, and looked at her with calm eyes. "A cabin," he said simply. "For you." Her breath caught in her throat. For her? No one had ever built anything for her, not even the smallest thing. She wanted to ask why, but the words tangled inside her. Daniel went back to work, each strike of his axe strong and sure. Emily stood watching him until the chill forced her back inside, her heart beating with an emotion she couldn't name. Over the next weeks, Daniel worked on the little cabin beside his own. Emily helped in the small ways she could. She held tools for him, carried nails, or handed him pieces of wood. She wasn't strong enough to lift the heavy logs, but Daniel never seemed to mind. When she apologized for not being able to do more, he only shook his head and told her, "Every hand makes a difference." Those words settled into her like a warm blanket. It was such a simple statement, yet no one had ever told her that before. At night, when the fire glowed in the hearth, Daniel would sit quietly with his carving knife, shaping bits of wood into useful objects. Emily would sew torn cloth or mend old blankets. They rarely spoke much, but the silence between them was gentle, not heavy like the silence she had endured in her family's home. It was as though words were not always needed. She began to feel safer, like the cabin walls around her were slowly closing out the cruel voices from her past. One afternoon, as the first snow began to fall, Emily stepped outside and saw the small cabin finally complete. It was simple but beautiful, with strong walls, a firm roof, and a door that Daniel had carved with patterns of leaves and vines. She pressed her hand against the wood and felt tears prick her eyes. She had been called useless all her life, yet here was proof that someone thought she was worth building for. She whispered softly to herself, "This is mine." The sound of her own voice startled her, but it also made her smile. Daniel didn't make grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but his actions spoke louder than anything Emily had known. He built shelves so she could keep her things in order. He carved a chair and a small table for her to use. When she tried to thank him, he only nodded as though it was nothing. But to Emily it was everything. She felt as if she was finally seen, as if she had finally stepped out of the shadows of her family's rejection. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. When Daniel went down to the village for supplies, whispers followed him. People asked why he would trouble himself with a girl like her. They called her the useless one again, said she would never be strong enough for mountain life. But Daniel never repeated their words to her. Instead, when he returned, he simply placed the things he had bought on the table, shared a quiet meal, and carried on as if the world's judgment had no power here in the forest. Emily, however, could not forget what others thought. Sometimes she lay awake, staring at the cabin roof, wondering if she truly deserved this new life. She worried that one day Daniel would see her the way her family had, weak, incapable, a mistake. Yet each morning he greeted her with the same steady kindness, and each evening he built something new to make her life easier. Slowly, her fears began to soften. One evening, after a long day of work, Daniel surprised her by setting a small wooden box in front of her. "For you," he said, his voice quiet as always. Inside the box was a carved hair comb, polished smooth with delicate patterns etched into the wood. Emily's eyes filled with tears. It wasn't just a gift, it was a message. She was worth time, worth effort, worth care. She had never been given anything so thoughtful before. With trembling hands, she slid the comb into her hair. For the first time, she looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror, and thought she didn't look useless at all. The days turned into weeks, and winter tightened its grip on the mountains. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, and the world outside became a silent sea of white. Inside, however, Emily felt warmth she had never known. She learned to make simple meals with the food Daniel brought in. She learned to keep the fire steady, proud each time the flames burned bright through the night. She began to hum softly while she worked, a habit that made Daniel glance at her with a faint smile, though he never commented. And then came the moment that stayed in her memory forever. One cold evening, as the snowstorm howled outside, Daniel finished placing the last touches on her cabin. He stepped back, wiped his hands on his coat, and said, almost as if to himself, "Every home needs a heart. This one is yours." Emily stood frozen in the doorway, her hands pressed to her chest. For a girl who had been told her whole life that she was nothing, those words were like a light shining in the dark. That night, as she lay under the blankets, Emily realized something had shifted deep inside her. She no longer felt like the unwanted girl who had been sold away. She felt like someone who mattered, someone who belonged. The mountain, the cabin, the firelight, it was becoming her world now. And though Daniel rarely spoke of feelings, his actions told her something even stronger. He did not see her as useless. He saw her as a person worth building for, worth protecting, and maybe even worth loving. Winter settled heavy over the mountains. Snow lay thick on the ground, and the forest seemed to hold its breath beneath the white silence. For Emily, each morning began with the same routine: feed the fire, boil water, sweep the floor, and wait for Daniel to return from his hunting or woodcutting. At first she felt clumsy, unsure if she was doing enough. But slowly, with each passing day, she began to feel less like a stranger in his home and more like part of the life he had built. Daniel noticed the small changes too. He never said much, but his quiet glances told her that he saw the effort she was making. When she managed to keep the fire alive through a long night, he nodded in approval. When she baked bread without burning it, he ate it without a word, yet his silence felt like praise. Emily found herself waiting for those little signs. They gave her strength, even when doubts whispered in the back of her mind. The mountain was not always gentle. There were nights when the wind rattled the windows and the roof creaked under the weight of snow. On such nights, Emily would lie awake, her heart racing, afraid the cabin might give way. But Daniel would rise, stoke the fire, and check the walls with steady hands. His calmness spread to her, and soon she began to believe that as long as he was there, she would be safe. Days turned into weeks, and Emily learned more about the rhythms of the forest. Daniel taught her how to recognize the tracks of deer in the snow, how to tell the difference between safe berries and poisonous ones once spring returned, and how to tie knots that would hold against the pull of wind. He was patient, never mocking her mistakes. She remembered her father once slapping her hand for failing to tie a rope correctly, the sting lingering long after the rope was forgotten. Daniel, however, simply untied her clumsy knot, placed the rope back in her hands, and told her to try again. That patience made her braver, willing to attempt things she would once have feared. Still, the world outside the mountain had not forgotten her. When Daniel occasionally traveled down to the village for supplies, Emily stayed behind. She dreaded the stares and whispers. Once, when Daniel insisted she come with him, she kept her head down as they walked through the market. She heard the villagers' voices, sharp, unkind. "That's the one they sold off," one woman murmured. "She won't last a year up there," said another. Emily's cheeks burned, and she pulled her scarf tighter around her face. But Daniel walked beside her as if he hadn't heard a word. His silence was not weakness, it was strength. By ignoring them, he showed her that their judgment did not matter here. That evening, back in the safety of the cabin, Emily felt the weight of the villagers' words press down on her. She sat quietly by the fire, her eyes lowered, until Daniel placed a wooden bowl of stew in front of her. "Don't listen to them," he said simply. It was one of the few times he spoke more than a few words at once. She lifted her eyes, surprised, and saw the firmness in his gaze. "They don't know you." "They never will." Those words warmed her more than the fire. She realized then that Daniel did not see her as the world did. He did not see her as useless or unwanted. He saw her as someone trying, someone learning, someone worth standing beside. Over time, Emily began to find joy in the smallest things. She loved the way the morning sun painted the snow in shades of pink and gold. She loved the crackle of the fire when she added fresh logs. She even loved the quiet hum of her own voice as she worked around the cabin. It was a simple life, but it was hers. For the first time, she did not feel like a burden. She felt like part of something steady, something real. One morning, Daniel showed her how to set snares for rabbits. Her fingers fumbled with the wire, but he guided her patiently. Later that day, when they returned, one of the snares held a rabbit. Emily's eyes widened in surprise. She had done it. Daniel handed the rabbit to her with a small smile and said, "You caught our supper." The pride in his voice filled her chest with warmth. She had never been praised for success before, not like this. It was a small thing, yet it felt like the whole world. Their bond deepened in quiet, unspoken ways. Emily began to notice how Daniel always left the best piece of meat for her at dinner, how he made sure her boots were dry after walking in the snow, how he paused his work when he sensed her struggling with hers. He never declared anything aloud, never made dramatic gestures, but his care was constant, steady as the mountain itself. And Emily, though shy and uncertain, began to return that care. She mended his torn shirts, kept the fire waiting for him when he came back cold and tired, and placed small touches around the cabin to make it feel warmer. The forest became her teacher, too. She learned its songs, its silences, its warnings. When she heard a wolf's distant howl, she no longer froze in fear. When the snow melted and streams swelled, she knew how to find safe paths. She began to walk with more confidence, her steps steady where once they had been unsure. But change also brought challenge. One harsh winter storm struck the mountain, heavier than any before. Snow piled against the cabin and winds howled like angry spirits. Daniel worked tirelessly to keep the roof strong, while Emily kept the fire alive. For 3 long days, they barely slept. When the storm finally passed, the cabin stood firm. Emily looked at the sturdy walls Daniel had built, then at the fire she had kept burning, and realized they had faced it together. She was no longer the girl waiting to be rescued. She had been part of their survival. The villagers' voices faded into memory, and Emily's own voice began to grow stronger. She laughed softly at small things now. The way the smoke curled oddly, or the way Daniel frowned when carving wood too roughly. Her laughter was gentle, but to Daniel it was like music he hadn't known he was missing. He never said so, but each time he heard it, he paused his work for a moment as though savoring the sound. One evening, after a long day of cutting wood and cooking stew, Emily sat outside her little cabin. The stars stretched endlessly above, brighter than she had ever seen in the village. The cold air stung her cheeks, but her heart was warm. Daniel stepped out beside her, folding his arms against the chill. They sat in silence, watching the night sky. Then, almost without thinking, Emily whispered, "Thank you." Daniel turned his head slightly. "For what?" he asked. "For this," she said, her voice trembling. "For giving me a place. For building me a home." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he nodded, his voice steady and low. "Everyone deserves a place." Emily's throat tightened with emotion. She realized then that she was no longer the girl her family had cast aside. She was someone who had found belonging, someone who had learned to stand, someone who was no longer invisible. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, she knew she was not walking it alone. The winter was long and harsh that year. Snow covered the mountains so deeply that even Daniel, with all his experience, admitted it was one of the hardest he had seen. Food became harder to find, and trips to the village grew dangerous. The wind cut sharp against the skin, and sometimes the cold seemed to seep right into their bones. Emily did everything she could to keep the fire alive and the cabin warm, but the days felt endless. One morning, Daniel returned from the forest slower than usual. His face was pale and his shoulders sagged under the weight of the logs he carried. Emily hurried to him, noticing the tired look in his eyes. He brushed her concern away with a small shake of his head, saying it was only weariness. But that night, as he lay down by the fire, she heard the sound of his breath coming too fast, too shallow. She touched his forehead and felt the heat burning through his skin. Daniel, the strong man she had always seen steady and unshaken, was sick. Fear rose inside her chest like a storm. She had never seen him like this before. He was always the one who fixed what was broken, who protected her from danger, who kept the cabin strong against the storms. Now he was lying weak, coughing, his body trembling with fever. For a long time, Emily sat frozen beside him, not knowing what to do. The old voices from her past crept back into her mind. Her father's words, her mother's sighs, the villagers' whispers. They all told her she was useless, too weak to help anyone. But then she looked at Daniel, his face pale and damp with sweat, and something inside her changed. This man had built her a cabin with his own hands, had given her a place when no one else wanted her. He had never treated her as a burden, never called her weak. He had given her a life worth living, and now he needed her. For the first time in her life, someone truly depended on her. Emily rose quickly and set to work. She gathered more wood, feeding the fire until the flames leapt high. She boiled water and soaked cloths to place on Daniel's forehead, hoping to draw out the fever. She remembered herbs Daniel had shown her in the forest, plants that could ease sickness. The snow outside was deep, but she wrapped herself in his heavy coat and stepped into the freezing air. Her hands shook from the cold, but she pressed on, searching through the snowy edges of the forest where dried plants still clung to life. When she returned, her cheeks raw from the wind, she made a bitter tea and coaxed Daniel to drink. The hours passed slowly. Daniel tossed and turned, his body burning with heat. Emily stayed awake, hardly daring to close her eyes. She wiped his face, gave him water, and whispered softly, though she wasn't sure he could hear, "You'll be all right. Please, hold on." Each time his breathing grew rough, her heart clenched in fear, but she refused to give in to despair. She could not fail him. Days blended together. Emily barely ate, living on bread and broth while she cared for him. At night she sat by the fire, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, her body aching but her spirit holding firm. She thought of the life she had left behind, the girl who had been sold, the girl who had been told she had no worth. That girl might have given up, but Emily was no longer that girl. She was someone new, someone stronger, and she would fight for Daniel's life with every ounce of strength she had. On the fourth day, Daniel opened his eyes clearer than before. He looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to understand why she was there beside him. His lips moved, his voice hoarse. "You kept me alive." Emily felt tears sting her eyes. She shook her head quickly, embarrassed, but he lifted a weak hand and touched hers. "You are stronger than you know." Those words sank into her heart like sunlight breaking through a storm. She pressed his hand gently, unable to speak, afraid her voice would tremble too much. In that moment, everything shifted between them. Daniel, the man who had always been her protector, had now seen her as his strength. As the days passed, his fever slowly broke. Color returned to his cheeks and his strength grew. Emily continued to care for him, even when he insisted he could manage on his own. She prepared food, made tea, and smiled when he teased her gently for fussing too much. But inside, she carried a deep pride. She had saved him. She had proven, to him, to herself, and to the silent ghosts of her past, that she was not useless. One evening, as Daniel sat by the fire recovering, he watched Emily move about the cabin. Her hair was tied back loosely, her hands steady as she prepared the stew. He saw how she checked the fire without being asked, how she hummed softly while she worked, how she carried herself with quiet confidence. For a long time he had lived alone, never imagining that anyone would share this life with him. Yet here she was, filling the cabin with warmth, turning the empty spaces into a home. When she handed him the bowl of stew, he took it but did not eat right away. Instead, he looked at her with an intensity that made her pause. "You are my wife," he said simply, his voice low but sure. Emily froze, the words echoing in her ears. For a moment she thought she had misheard. "Wife?" she whispered. Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. "Not because of what your family said. Not because of what anyone thinks. But because you have given me more than I ever expected. You've given me life. You are my wife in truth." Her throat tightened and she turned her face away, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. She had been sold as if she were worth nothing, treated as though she were little more than an object. Yet here was this man, calling her his wife not out of duty but out of respect and love. She wanted to answer, but no words came. Instead, she placed her hand gently on his shoulder, and he understood everything she could not say. That night, as the fire burned low, Emily lay awake in her small cabin, her heart full. She thought of the girl she had once been, the girl who had been cast aside, and she thought of the woman she was becoming here in the mountains, beside a man who saw her value. For the first time in her life, she did not feel invisible. She felt cherished. The winter slowly gave way to spring. Snow melted. Streams rushed with fresh water and new leaves unfurled on the trees. With the change in season came a change in Emily, too. She walked with a straighter back, her voice no longer trembling when she spoke. The villagers' cruel words no longer haunted her. She had proven to herself that she was capable of more than anyone had believed. Every time she saw Daniel, stronger now and returning to his work, she felt a surge of pride. Not just because she had saved him, but because together they had survived the hardest winter. They were no longer two separate souls, one strong and one weak. They were partners bound by something deeper than words. Spring brought new life to the mountains. Snow melted into rushing streams and the forest bloomed in shades of green. Birds returned, filling the mornings with song and the air softened with warmth. Emily felt that the world around her mirrored the change within herself. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been sent away. Each day she rose with a sense of purpose, ready to work alongside Daniel, ready to meet the challenges of mountain life. She tended to the garden Daniel had planted near the cabin, her hands in the soil, her heart light as she watched seedlings push through the earth. She learned to carry water more steadily, to bake bread without burning it, and to stitch stronger seams into clothing. Daniel still chopped wood and hunted, but now she shared the work in ways she had never imagined she could. Each small task gave her confidence. With every passing week, she felt stronger, Daniel noticed. Though he did not speak much, his eyes followed her as she moved about the cabin. He saw the way she no longer lowered her gaze in shame, the way her steps had grown steadier, the way her voice no longer trembled when she spoke. He admired her quiet determination, and though he rarely said the words, he made his pride clear in his actions. When she returned from the garden carrying vegetables, he smiled softly. When she managed to mend his coat neatly, he wore it as though it were new. And when she laughed, something she did more often now, he would pause in his work, letting the sound linger in the air. For Emily, these moments meant everything. She had lived her whole life hungering for recognition, for a sign that she mattered. With Daniel, she did not have to ask. His care was shown in the way he built shelves for her sewing, the way he always made sure her boots were warm, the way he carved small wooden figures and left them quietly on her table. He didn't call her useless. He called her wife. But outside their mountain home, the villagers still remembered her differently. When Daniel traveled to the village for supplies, Emily often went with him. At first she kept her head down, nervous of the whispers she might hear. Yet something had changed in her heart. Instead of shame, she felt a quiet strength. She walked beside Daniel, not behind him, her steps steady on the dirt road. People noticed. They stared, but not in the same way as before. She was no longer the pale, timid girl they remembered. Her cheeks glowed with the color of the mountain air. Her eyes were brighter and her posture carried quiet dignity. Some still whispered, but others began to soften. They saw how Daniel treated her, not as a burden, but as his partner. They saw how she carried herself, not as a discarded girl, but as a woman who belonged. News traveled slowly through small places, but it always traveled. One day, Emily's own family heard of her visits to the village. They had not thought much about her since she had left. To them, she had been a problem solved, a mouth less to feed. But when they heard that she was living in the mountains with Daniel, their curiosity grew. Some said she would not last a season. Others said she would return broken. But now, a year later, they heard a different story. She was thriving. She had become someone new. Her family finally saw her again when the village gathered for the spring market. Emily and Daniel arrived early, carrying furs and herbs to trade. Emily wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, her hair tied neatly, her head held high. Daniel walked beside her with his usual calm strength, his hand brushing hers as they moved through the crowd. The moment her family spotted her, they froze. Her mother's eyes widened. Her father's mouth opened slightly, and her siblings stared as though they did not recognize her. This was not the weak girl they had cast aside. This was a woman with confidence in her step, warmth in her expression, and a man at her side who clearly cherished her. Emily noticed them too. For a heartbeat, her chest tightened with old pain. Memories rushed back. The nights of being called useless, the day they sent her away without a tear. But she did not lower her eyes or shrink back. Instead, she met their stares with calm. For the first time, she felt no need to beg for their approval. She had already found her worth, and it was not in their hands anymore. Her father stepped forward awkwardly. "Emily," he said, his voice uncertain. She waited, expecting the old harshness, but it didn't come. Instead, there was something softer in his tone, something almost like regret. Her mother fidgeted beside him, her eyes darting between Emily and Daniel. None of them seemed to know what to say. Daniel, as always, stayed silent. He placed a steady hand on Emily's shoulder, reminding her that she was not alone. She drew strength from his touch, then spoke in a voice clear and steady. "I am well," she said. "I am where I belong." Her family had no answer. They could see the truth in her eyes. She was no longer the girl they had dismissed. She was a wife, a partner, a woman with dignity. They could see it in the way Daniel looked at her, in the way she stood by his side, in the way her hands carried the signs of work and life well lived. From that day on, the whispers in the village began to change. People still talked, but now they spoke of the woman who had found strength in the mountains, the woman who had saved the mountain man during his illness, the woman who had built a life where none thought she could. Emily's story became less of a scandal and more of a quiet inspiration. Back in the mountains, Emily continued to grow. She tended her garden, cared for the animals Daniel brought, and kept their home filled with warmth. Daniel finished small touches on her cabin, adding windows for light and a porch where she liked to sit at dusk. Together, they faced the seasons, the storms, and the quiet days. Sometimes at night, Emily would sit by the fire and think of her journey. She thought of the girl who had been sold, the girl who had cried silently on the wagon ride into the mountains. That girl seemed like a stranger now. She had been given away as useless, yet here she was, living a life full of meaning. She had been rejected, yet she was now cherished. Daniel, too, often reflected on the change. He had lived years in silence, believing he would always be alone. But Emily had filled his cabin with warmth, his days with laughter, and his nights with peace. He did not need to tell her often, she already knew. But sometimes, as they sat together watching the sunset over the mountains, he would turn to her and say softly, "You are my heart. You are my wife." Each time Emily's eyes would fill with quiet joy. She no longer needed the world's approval, nor even her family's. The only truth that mattered was the life they had built together, the cabin, the fire, the mountain, and the love that grew stronger with each passing season. And so, the story of the girl once sold as useless became the story of a woman cherished as priceless. Emily had not only found her place, but she had found herself. The mountains had tested her, but they had also given her back her worth. And in Daniel's steady presence, she had discovered what it truly meant to be seen, to be valued, to be loved.